Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Alana Gomez. I'm the educator at America 250 NC. If you haven't heard yet, we are commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence signing this July or next July 2026. So thank you again for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to host you all here at the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources here at the State Archives building. If you've never been here yet, on a day they're open, you should definitely check them out. This evening is part of our America 250 NC programming. As I mentioned, we are commemorating the 250th anniversary of America's founding and highlighting North Carolina's role in our country's beginnings and history. We're proud to partner tonight with UNC Press and the UNC-Chapel Hill Department of History to celebrate their work in teaching the foundations of American democracy. Tonight, you'll hear from a group of distinguished Carolina historians who created a new collection of primary source documents on the American founding and the fight to form a more perfect union. This new book from UNC Press includes historical documents like the Declaration of Independence, North Carolina State Constitution, which I believe you can see out that door, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, all the way up to the 20th century Supreme Court cases that involve foundational questions of American democracy. And they're all introduced with commentary and context from UNC historians. To moderate our discussion this evening, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Darin Waters, seated to my right, the Deputy Secretary of Archives and History here at the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Dr. Waters holds a doctorate in history from UNC-Chapel Hill, so I know he's especially excited to introduce this project and explore the importance of teaching honest history in support of American democracy. I hope you'll stick around afterward to see some of the State Archives' fantastic founding documents out this way of North Carolina that we've put on display in our lobby, and to continue this important conversation over a glass of wine. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Waters.
Thank you, Alana, and thank you all for joining us here tonight. I'd also like to recognize the Secretary of our department, Secretary Pamela Caswell, who is sitting down here in the front, and thank her for being here this evening as well. We do have a truly stellar group of historians with us tonight, all of them giants in their scholarly fields and all of them great teachers just up the road in Chapel Hill. I should know. I had Dr. Brundage, who is sitting right here to my right, was on my dissertation committee, and let's hope he didn't have buyer's remorse. I was jokingly saying just a few minutes ago that when the going got tough with him, I'd go see Dr. DuVal to continue to stay in the program. But so glad to have them here tonight. I've already mentioned the name of Dr. Brundage, who is the William Umstead Distinguished Professor of History at Carolina, where he focuses on the history of the American South in the years after the Civil War. We also have with us Dr. Kathleen DuVal. She is the Karl W. Ernst Distinguished Professor of History at Carolina, where she focuses on early American history and the history of Native nations. Also with us is Dr. Joseph Glattar. I want to make sure I say his name right. Glattar. He is the Stevenson Distinguished Professor of History at Carolina with a focus on the American Civil War and American military history. He was at Carolina while I was there, but we never had a chance to cross paths. That's probably good for him. This is an incredible collection of talent to have from our flagship public university. We can personally attest to that the UNC History Department was a remarkable place to study. It really was. I have, Chapel Hill is kind of like my Mecca. It is the place that I go back to get myself together when I'm having those moments of kind of, those destabilizing moments. So I want to thank these professors for what they do on a daily basis. Some people will ask me, why did I focus on a PhD in history? Well, it had a lot to do with trying to understand who we are as a people. And so it was there that I think that I found the grounding to two questions that I feel are very important. One being, who are we and who do we want to be? And it was through my time there that I was able to begin to develop some answers to those questions. I had the remarkable experience of one time sitting in an interview with the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, and I was struck by something that he actually said in that interview when he said, "This is the only country that has been born out of an idea." And that idea, we know what that is. And so how are we doing? How are we doing as we move towards this so-called more perfect union? So I'm glad that you all have joined us tonight. And I want to dive right into this book, this important book that they have put together, and the broader project of teaching the foundations of American democracy to today's college students. So with that, we'll begin with the first question. Sit back down, you all. And I do have some questions for you all tonight. My first question really centers around the question of why. Why this book? Why now? What motivated you to create this new primary source reader, and how do you hope it gets used?
I'll field that. The state of North Carolina established a requirement that every student who goes to a state university must take a course called Foundations in American Democracy, and that course must explore documents from the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Emancipation Proclamation, Federalist Papers, letter from Birmingham Jail, from Martin Luther King, Gettysburg Address, and the North Carolina State Constitution. So Miguel Lacerna, the chairman of the history department, and I had a conversation about this, and we thought that if we're going to have to teach it, we ought to have a good reader from which the students could draw. And we have a phenomenal history department. It is literally one of the best history departments in the world, and we have so many good people. It was crazy not to just tap our talents. And so we asked Kathleen, DuVal, and Fitz Brundage to join us, and we began brainstorming on topics that we thought needed to be covered in this, and who we would ask within the department. We ended up getting 11 people to participate. Everyone we asked, as I recall, agreed to participate. And the amazing thing is, we then contacted UNC Press, and they were eager to pursue it. The system, or the dean's office, I should say, kicked in some money to help defray expenses. And then the system office stepped in as well, UNC system. So it's a huge project involving all sorts of aspects of the institution that we call the University of North Carolina. And so, as a result, we produced a book in an incredible time. Every single author made the deadline. You don't know how hard that is. And as a result, we had every person who was doing one of the chapters write an introduction to that document, produce the document, or if it's an extremely long document, edit it down to a manageable size, and then include questions for discussion, and then follow that with selected readings so interested students could do more. And the press really pushed it, and so we had it ready for the fall semester. In addition, the system came through by helping us produce it so that everyone who attends a university in North Carolina, state university, or community college, or is willing to go to their public library, can get a copy of this book for free. And by the way, no one in the history department made a penny on it. I also want to thank one other institution, the New York Times. We couldn't get a photograph of Martin Luther King. So I thought, well, a newspaper's bound to have one. So I contacted the New York Times, and they let us use it for $500 for 5,000 printed copies, which they said was an unbelievable deal. They said, we usually charge way, way more. And I said, listen, no one's making any money. This is for kids, for students. And so after begging and pleading, we got it. So that's how it's operated. Any of you want to add anything?
I just add, I'm sorry, one thing I would add is, I think the gestation time, just to put this into perspective, was roughly January of this year, we started work on this, and it's in your hands now. So that's testimony to both the people who contributed, but also to the press, to be able to turn it out that fast.
Yeah, I want to add NC Live is why any North Carolinian can actually sit in their own house and log in and have access to it through their local library. And also our undergraduate students, we have a lot of work studies who work in our department, and they did some copy editing for us and all kinds of things. They're all in the acknowledgement. So it was a big, big group effort.
And then there's Sophie. Where's Sophie?
Not here yet.
Not here yet. Well, Sophie's, yeah, we definitely need to offer her praise.
So can you all talk a little bit more about the course itself, Foundations of American Democracy? What are some of the requirements for this particular course?
So what we're doing in Chapel Hill, at least, and I can't speak to the other system schools, is that it's a designation that can be put onto a class. So any class that fulfills the FAD requirement will teach these, I think it's 6 documents, and will also teach about the founding and citizenship, but it is within the context of an entire class. So for example, my American Revolution class fulfills this. So I've taught this class for 23 years at UNC, but I teach the history of the American Revolution, which of course always talks about the founding and citizenship. I make sure that we give a prominent place to these required documents, but then they read lots of other documents as well. So existing classes now can fulfill it, but then people are also proposing and now teaching new classes, sort of inspired by it, but what they want to teach and how they want to teach it.
Let me add just one other thing. The state required 7 documents that we cover, but a college semester is 14 weeks long.
15 and a half, I think.
Yeah, but you have a little vacation in there.
Or Joe does.
I have a perpetual vacation. I'm just retired. So anyway, we wanted to offer other documents on other subjects so that individuals who are teaching the class have flexibility. They can choose other things. So there are 21 different documents in the reader.
So I know it is a book that has been designed for this particular class, but can we talk about the citizens of North Carolina writ large? Are you hoping that they will engage this text as well? And could you talk a little bit about how we might introduce this text to the larger public?
Absolutely. These are not random documents, right? These ones that were chosen by the Board of Governors, they are essential to understanding the question you posed, who we are, right? How we got here, why we're a republic and why that matters. And so I think just, we originally sort of thought this would be useful in classrooms because frankly, colleges and universities are scrambling to cover this if every single one of their students is gonna have to take a class like this. But I think it was only, it's hard to believe it was such a short amount of time. Since we started working on this, we started thinking this is a much bigger opportunity than that. This is for North Carolinians and beyond to think about citizenship, to read maybe some documents they actually haven't read. I gotta say, I read the Federalist Papers more closely than I ever had before, and I studied the Revolutionary Era. I knew number 10, but had I read all of them?
It's not easy reading.
It's exactly not easy, not short. And so, yeah, I think what I hope is in this volume, because each of them has an introduction and a couple of discussion questions and some further reading, it can do exactly the kind of thing that we want to do as teachers in our classrooms for a broader public, which is, you, the reader, you interpret it yourself, right? Here it is. It's important. We guide you a little bit, but it's you in the document at the end of the day.
I'll just add that I think one of the values of this collection is to, in an era of certainly polarized political debate, but also political debate that, and I'm not speaking about anybody in particular or any political party, but where the substance of public discourse has certainly been debased in various ways. To read Lincoln's second inaugural address is to read as eloquent English prose as you'll ever read, and to realize that it is possible to have very, very elevated and deeply moral political discourse. And that, I just picked that one out because that document to me is the most moving in this entire collection, just as a piece of prose. So I think it's valuable for students and everyone for that matter. I think it would be a healthy exercise which if we had an annual occasion to read Lincoln's second inaugural address instead of some other occasions.
I think the documents have affected who we are as a people, and what's more important, what we should continue to aspire to. The lessons in those documents are priceless. And I think that's why it's such an important contribution.
For those of you who have not seen the book yet, once it comes out, I do encourage you to get it. I had a chance just to read the introduction itself. The introduction of the book is powerful. A lot of questions that were coming to my mind. There's some phrases that you use here that I'd like for you to talk to us about a little bit, if you don't mind. One of the things that stood out to me as I read the introduction was this the sentence that you have, understanding the proper balance between order and liberty. What does that mean? What is the proper balance between order and liberty, and why is it important for us to think about that?
So this is I talk to my students about this all the time in the Revolution class. This is one of the many, many things that the founders of our country, I'll say not just the founding fathers, obviously, but people beyond them thinking like, what does this mean to be a country worried about? They fought a revolution for liberty, right? And you cannot live without order. Like they're opposites at in some sense they are opposites. Complete liberty is anarchy, and complete order is definitely not liberty, right? It is a crackdown, a diminishment of our liberties. And balancing that is something that the founders broadly in this country worried about and had different opinions about, right? How do we make sure the people have their liberties that we fought for, that they spoke of in all these documents, and yet can live day to day without worrying about their safety? And that, I think obviously that's something that Americans have struggled with all the way through our history, and other countries struggle with too. And I think it's really important to know that in 1776, 1783, and 1789, they were worried about those things too.
I just add that I think that the search for order it's a famous book title. Some of you may have encountered it as undergraduates, but as Kathleen was saying, I do think it's a continuous thread, not just in American history, but in modern global history, that the challenge of modernity is somehow to find order. And what I think is so interesting about the United States is that we've been asking a question every society in the world's been asking or addressing, but the inflections that Americans have put on it. So I think of one of Lincoln's first important speeches was where he was grappling with the question of order and abolitionism and vigilantism in American society. The so-called progressives at the turn of the 20th century were trying to figure out how to organize industrial urban society. And then more recently, you can talk from President Richard Nixon onward, the rhetoric of the war on crime is all about, we've been 50 years of a war on crime in America, and it's about order, order, order. And the question of liberty, of course, is tied to that. So I think that persistence of that thread is really important to keep in mind.
Well, you all also raise some very important questions here in the introduction. There's one paragraph here that I have it completely underlined here at the very beginning. And you're right here. The questions at the heart of the founding of the American Republic have been central throughout the nation's history. Some of those questions are, who are the people? And how do they make their wills known? How do people balance liberty and order without tipping, as you have put Dr. DuVal, into either anarchy or tyranny? Who would represent the people? And how much should they be beholden to our will? Those are major, major questions. Is it possible for government, in the words of the Constitution's preamble, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity? Now, you go on to say about these particular documents that, and I would like to ask about those questions. How did you all come to those questions? Why do you see those questions as being important for us to think about and engage about democracy? And also, you make the point that it is important to understand these particular documents in their context. Can you tease that out for us just a little bit? What do you mean by thinking about these documents in their context?
I'll just jump in quickly. Again, I'll talk about the second inaugural address just because, to me, it's just a remarkable document. Imagine the context in which Lincoln was delivering that. The Union was poised to win. There was no question the Confederacy was going to lose by that point in time. He had just won re-election, which was a surprise to some, and it had been long odds in certain ways for him to win re-election. And again, to return, the Civil War was in the process of winding down, and it had been the bloodiest modern struggle that any American, of course, had any familiarity with, and for that matter, most of the world's observers hadn't seen a war like that. And yet, in this context, it's not a triumphant speech. He doesn't get up there and say, we won. We have defeated the white slaveocracy of the South. He didn't, all of the predictable, what we might assume to be the typical human emotional response to the circumstances, he seems to bury into this reflection about the very deepest causes of the war and what it's going to take to somehow rebuild an American republic. And so to me, the historical context there is just so remarkable, and that he did it in fewer than 900 words. And so, to me, that's an example where incredibly deep thinking in a very particular historic moment is then reflected in language of extreme, it's limpid, crystal clear prose. There's not a word there that an 8th grader wouldn't understand. So to me, that's where a document in its historical context has tremendous power.
Yeah, in a different context and not quite as beautiful prose, my favorite document, if I can have one, in here is sitting right out there in the hallway, the North Carolina 1776 state constitution. The Continental Congress declares independence, starts to write the Articles of Confederation, which frankly aren't going to be all that important, and it says states, you got to make governments, right? We have just kicked out a government. We have to make new governments, and it's got to be at the state level, and it's going to be at the local level too. And so North Carolinians get together and they take up that charge, and they write a state constitution in that context, in the context of complete lack of legitimacy. You know, they are committing treason. They are rebelling against their king, and it is a document that says, you know, what do you do if you represent the people? Because, right, they're elected to that convention. And yet the world probably thinks you're illegitimate. And that's, you know, I think that context helps us understand that our first state constitution, and also North Carolina state constitution, is one of the most democratic of the state constitutions. North Carolina was right out in front.
I want you to think about the Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln going into Gettysburg. He's got smallpox. Nonetheless, he delivers this fabulous speech, which he finishes that morning, and he reminds everyone that the United States was a beacon of liberty for the world. That we had a government by the people, for the people, and of the people. And the Civil War was to ensure that it would never perish, this concept. I mean, it's amazing when you think about it and when you put it in that context. We were such a novel country at the time. And yes, we had horrible racism, but we had just destroyed the institution of slavery. And yes, women were badly discriminated against, so were immigrants. But still, by comparison with other countries, we were light years ahead of them. It's an amazing story when you put it in those contexts.
How are students responding to this particular course and these particular documents? And here I'm thinking about my own experiences in the classroom. I mean, and going back to that conversation that I had with Mitch Landrieu when he said, the only country born out of an idea. And we know the Declaration of Independence is one of the documents that you have here, and thinking about what is in that particular document and what it has meant to so many different people. But then at the beginning, thinking about the context of 1776, not everyone was included in that. So I had at one point asked my students, does America have a mission? If we think about the Declaration, does it give this country a mission? And I was surprised to find that students had a difficult time responding to that question because of disenchantment with where we are. So are you experiencing the same thing? And in teaching these documents, is it helping people to come to terms with the ongoing process, as you all note in the introduction here, that our democracy is a process, right? That is ongoing, that is negotiated.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed, and it's been the last few years. As I said, I've been teaching this Revolution class for over 20 years. And it was several years ago, I was giving some lectures, looking down at my notes, looking up and down. I was talking about the 18th century. And suddenly I looked up and I thought, they're looking at me like I'm saying something different from what I've said in the past. And I've definitely given this lecture before. And I realized that these words mean something different now than they did 20 years ago. I think 20 years ago, I taught the American Revolution and students thought, that's interesting. And that is not what they think now. They think, I'm sure some of them are sleeping, but 120 out of 150 students sitting in the auditorium are sometimes literally on the edge of their seats. And I think, what has happened? And I think they just, whatever their politics are, I'm sure they have very different politics. Many of them don't care that much about politics at all, but they know that they want to know more about where the United States came from, why it matters that we're a republic, and lots of questions they don't even know that they have when they come into a class about the American Revolution or any of these other classes that are now going to be talking about some of the ideas we're talking about here tonight. And for that class, I have always used the Declaration of Independence to structure that class. I read out of it on the first day, and we go back to it over and over, and sometimes I'm literally just reading it out loud and parts of it out loud. And it's, as Fitz said, that the beautiful writing is it's a powerful thing, right? And then, of course, we can talk about Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," and we can read the Seneca Falls document that echoes the language of the Declaration of Independence, but talks about men and women. And I think, I am interested to see where it will go in the next couple of years and how students are thinking newly. But I feel like they are so eager for the kind of thing we do right? We don't tell students what to think. We don't tell them how to interpret a document. We give them the document and we give them some context, and we try to help them work on their skills of reading and interpretation. And I think that's what I think that's what they need. And I also think that's what a lot of them really, really want out of education.
And I think another valuable lesson that these texts and a course like Foundations of American Democracy can do is to teach students, make students aware that there have been moments of tremendous pessimism about American democracy. And they're not the first generation, if they are pessimistic for whatever reason. Of course, before the Civil War, there was deep pessimism. In the late 19th, early 20th century, we have to remember there was deep pessimism in certain circles about the evolution of American society and the emergence of robber barons and plutocrats. During the 1930s, there was, of course, good grounds for deep pessimism. And then we forget that a document like the Port Huron Statement in 1963 was a powerful critique of American society and all of the ills that it had produced. Regardless of your politics, the point that I'm making there about the Port Huron Statement was it was a deeply pessimistic document about American society. So we've gone through cycles of deep trenches of pessimism about American institutions. And somehow, doesn't mean it will always happen, not inevitable, but somehow Americans have somehow regenerated their enthusiasm to varying degrees for American institutions and democracy.
And I would be curious to hear from all of you all's perspective. What is it that you think brings about those moments of renewal? Is fair question?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'll just quickly say one thing. It's not coincidental that usually eras of economic prosperity have usually been very important. So eras of economic and social anxiety seem to go ahead, strongly tied to concerns about pessimism. But I don't want to just reduce it to
Right. You're Dr. Brundage, you're in my head because this is another piece of the introduction that stood out to me. But before I make this point and raise the question and get your perspective on this, I also would like to hear, Dr. DuVal, I heard you use the word republic, right? Understanding the difference and the distinction between a democracy and a republic. Is there one? Do students understand that? And what do we need to know about the difference between a democracy and a republic?
One of the things I try to, I mean, there are political scientists and historians and lots of different people have semantic distinctions. But one of the things I tell my students is one of the differences is public opinion. When the Republic was created and the men who wrote most of the founding documents, they imagined a populace that would, some of whom would have the vote and would get to elect their representatives. And then they'd send their representatives off to in Philadelphia, later Washington, New York, Washington, or wherever the North Carolina capital happened to be, eventually settled here, and then not really bug them in between elections. And I think one of the things that happened in the 19th century is we became a democracy, and more people got the vote, some sooner than others, right? But also what we think between elections also matters. And I think mostly that's a really good thing. And it also it can be an unbalancing thing. And so, yeah, democracies are messy and
And can be scary.
It can be scary. I knew you would finish the sentence for me.
Yeah, it can be scary.
What was Churchill's line? It's something to the effect of, it's the worst form of government except for all the others. There's a lot of truth to it. It's extremely messy. I mean, remember, we didn't have direct election of senators until the 20th century. We still have the Electoral College.
And we still have a Senate on the basis of 2 per state. So Wyoming, which has a population which I assume is not as large as the Triangle's population, is represented by 2 senators.
That's right.
That's a republic.
That's right. There are some republic parts.
In the introduction, you write about the term economic advancement is here, freedom and economic advancement, and you're talking about part 2 of the book, and a more perfect union, the officer, a selection of documents related to the American Civil War and Reconstruction since the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The free and slave states struggled over territories and the future direction of the country. This conflict destroyed every major intersectional institution in the United States, to your point, Dr. Brundage, and eventually the nation itself. 11 states sought to overturn the outcome of a fair and free election by seceding from the United States. Those remaining states viewed the Constitution as the bedrock of political freedom and economic advancement. When I read that, I wrote in the margins a question: how important is economic advancement to the stability of a democracy?
I think one of the wonders of the U.S. Constitution was that it set up a system that looked after 2 elements of society: people and property. And as a result, our form of capitalism blends beautifully with our system of government and our system of that as created by the Constitution. So as a result, you know, it's always been a land, and we're of course also endowed with a lot of natural resources and other things, but it's been a land of great economic opportunity. And that's why immigrants come here. I mean, that's the bottom line. I saw a great interview with a sweet potato farmer in Mississippi, and he said, "You want to stop the immigration problem? Quit eating." And he's right. You know, we need labor for these sorts of things. So, but that's the capitalist system, and how beautifully it works with our form of government.
What I'm curious about, Dr. Glitar, to the point that you just made in thinking about this issue of economic advancement, and my friend out here in the audience, King Prater, is probably going to laugh because he knows that I end up talking about Alexis de Tocqueville a lot, right? I'm curious about, you know, the documents. The Constitution of the United States is not included as one of the documents here, right? I see North Carolina's Constitution is, and I wanted to ask you about that. But my reading of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which, you know, we're coming, I guess, close to the 200th anniversary of the publication of that book, which I'm hoping that there will be some activity around that. This book, it's a very engaging book. But he seems, at least in my translation that I've read, to have been concerned about the American form of democracy and this capitalistic connection to it, and makes the argument that while democracy is the wave of the future, that the democracy that we saw developing in the United States might not be the democracy that the rest of the world needs. And I'm glad to see Dr. Brundage shaking his head in agreement here, because again, it was hard to be one of his students because his critique is.
We'll have to talk about that later.
But so has our democracy been too heavily influenced by this capitalist ethos that drives us?
Keep in mind that I'm not suggesting that we aren't a classless society. Of course we are a class society. But entree is generally due to wealth. It's not hereditary. And that was one of the things that Europeans were accustomed to. There was not just a hereditary wealth, but the heredity tended to rule. And the United States, I mean, can you imagine saying that to Andrew Jackson? He would have beat the crap out of you. He did once or twice on people. But, I mean, it's just a very different structure. And I think de Tocqueville had struggled with that, the freedom that people had, the familiarity that it bred, and things of that nature.
And of course, you know, this being history, maybe all history, certainly American history, you know, many times two things are true at the same time. So the repercussions of that intertwining have been horrific in many ways. The promise that American citizenship can rest on land ownership, your family can have its own land, and that will enable you to be a free citizen without a landlord, without a boss. That's amazing, and that's central to America. But it rests on the assumption that native land belongs to the United States. Right? Both things are true. Slavery continues long after many Americans wish it would end, shall we say, because it is economically important to the survival of the United States. Both things are true.
And I think what both Kathleen and Joe have raised draws our attention to something that isn't prominent in the collection, but is implicit, is how important the American legal tradition is, and especially in the American legal tradition, the privileging of property, and a particular ideal of property. There are other societies that they're democratic, and they have different ways of dealing with defining property and control over property. So I think that's an important subtext.
Right.
There's also another issue at work here, and that is how quickly immigrants could get a voice in their own government. These people came from countries in Europe, they had no say. I remember looking up a few years ago, you could go to Wisconsin, and as long as you pledged that you wanted to stay in the United States, you could vote. You could vote legally. Now, lots of people in New York voted right off the boat, but technically that was illegal. But when you have a place like Wisconsin allowing people who simply voice an intent to stay, being able to vote, and then think of the power that these people feel. They have a say in who's governing them. This is a revolutionary concept for poor people. They didn't have those opportunities.
Let me just offer a counterpoint, though, that, of course, if you got off the boat from China, you weren't going to vote.
No.
If you got off the boat from Tokyo, you weren't going to vote. Or if you walked across the border from Saltillo, Mexico, you weren't going to vote, depending on where it was. So the point be that the definition, coming back to your point, who are we? The definition of who we are has sometimes been, of course, very exclusionary. Mm-hmm. So there are people who are Americans who didn't enjoy those privileges. Mm-hmm. And of course, then there are women who didn't enjoy those privileges either.
All right. I don't want to hijack this with a conversation about Tocqueville, but it's kind of gone in that direction.
You have the microphone.
Okay.
So.
and I think, to me, as I read this, Tocqueville was just yelling in my head as I read the introduction to the book today and thinking about these documents that you have here. There's some other I do want to ask before I go on with the Tocqueville question. No, let me go on with the Tocqueville question. Because in my reading, you get to the second volume of Democracy in America, and he seems to suggest about our philosophical understanding as Americans, that he writes that this is probably the most unphilosophical country that he had ever engaged. Right? The conversation that we are having tonight is a deeply philosophical question, right? How do you get the average citizen to engage that conversation? I mean, the thing that I try to stress to my own kids is that the 4 years that you go to college is an opportunity that you will not have again, right? It's an opportunity to engage intellectually the mind. And but for those who are saying that you no longer need to do that, and Tocqueville making the argument that he says, and I don't have the quote here in front of me, where he says there's this anxiety that I see in America that people are so driven for economic gain that they tend to forget the past, they tend to forget the ideas of their forefathers and take no care of them. So this book is an effort to re-engage these ideas, right, and to show how through a process of time, we've expanded the boundaries of freedom in this country. How do we get the general public to re-engage in this very economic, most powerful economic country in the world? How do we get people to re-engage? Is that a fair question?
No, I think it would be a great question to open up to the audience. There are many people in the audience here tonight who probably can answer that better than we, who are actively working with how to do public history, how to get this kind of conversations out to the public. And I think it's so important because it's a question. It's philosophical, right? It's not. We don't have the answers to how our country was or should be, but we can open conversations. And I don't know, somehow I feel like, in the same way that we try to remind our students and that thing, enjoy your 4 years of college, if we could remind American citizens, this has always been a conversation. It's always been a philosophical debate, among other things. I sort of imagine if we had a different kind of level of conversation with one another in this country, we'd have I'll feel a little better. That's not an answer.
Do we have any high school history teachers here? All right, I don't want to offend. I have immense respect for high school history teachers. I would love to stab a stake in the heart of APUSH, AP US History. I watched my son go through that, and I don't think he learned anything because he'd grown up steeped in the stuff anyways. He couldn't help it. But I was fascinated at how so this is a course that theoretically the college-prone students are likely to take. I think he would have been better served by an American history course in high school rather than APUSH. APUSH absolutely drained everything of interest from American history and turned it into this granular little. Anyways, I throw that out there because I think the shame is where high school students aren't, I think, prone to be geared towards history. I fully understand it at that stage of life. But I do speak from my own experience. I had a wonderful high school history teacher. And for example, on the Revolutionary era, our textbook was Gore Vidal's Burr, which was a wonderful way to read about the Revolution. Now, I know you couldn't do that in a contemporary American high school probably. People would ban it. But when we got to the pre-Civil War era, we read a book. This is a book by Fred Somkin called When the Eagle Roared, which is about American imperialism, the Mexican-American War. And then we read Matthew Josephson's The Robber Barons, for the Gilded Age. We got extremely, what would be the word, powerfully argued texts that we then engaged with. So the point being is I think people should, at the earliest possible age, students should be introduced to the idea of history as a discussion, as a debate, as something to be argued over in a civil, professional, or whatever the right word, academic way, but that it is a contested topic. And the answers to it are not only interesting, I think, but also directly related to these important questions that students may not as 14-year-olds be thinking about, but they will be when they're 18 and they're 19. So my simple plea is please drive a stake in the heart of APUSH.
I know, did we want to give an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions? I think that's what we said we were going to do. There's a microphone here. And I hope I didn't sideline us too much with this, but this has been an engaging conversation. You've got me thinking.
Since we were on this Tocqueville riff, I did want to say one of my favorite things that Tocqueville talks about is Americans as a people in motion.
Yes.
Because I think that's another aspect of Americans that is, regardless of your class, your ethnic background, whether you're a Native American or an enslaved person, motion is part of your experience as an American, which I think is profoundly different, say, from, for example, many Brits.
And there's so many other components that if we had time, we could go into because, and Dr. DuVal, this may be, I don't know if it was from a conversation, but I know from a class, it had to be a class at Chapel Hill and the engagement that I had there in the history department, but thinking about how others have influenced our democracy, not looking at the post-Civil War period, but even as it was developing, right? Thinking about Native communities, and I think about the Iroquois here, right? That there are some influences that the Iroquois had on our, as I understand it, I don't want to be speaking out of turn here, but can you talk about that a little bit, and do students from this course get a better understanding of how we've borrowed ideas from other people?
Yeah, right. Nobody starts anything from scratch. So certainly not as big as a government that they're creating. And so when you read the sort of what most of the authors of Articles of Confederation and the Constitution say, they're looking mostly to models from ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and they're really worried that republics fall, right? So they're mostly talking about that. But they also live on a continent that has had democracy for almost 1,000 years, right? Small scale democracies, for the most part, small to medium scales. And European colonization is old by that point. So it's hard to draw direct lines, but certainly Benjamin Franklin and others knew about the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and how it was a republic, right? It was a representative government with all kinds of checks and balances. So it's hard to say, there's much ink spilled about exactly the connections, but they knew they lived on a continent with a different kind of governing, certainly a non-monarchical kind of governing.
Wonderful. Any questions from the audience?
We don't take questions from former colleagues.
As long as Kathleen is answering, we'll accept the question from Lloyd Kramer.
That's an intimidating introduction, but
A little bit of cancel culture there.
thank you. I deeply appreciate what you all have done in creating this collection of documents, and I love Alexis de Tocqueville, but I'm not going to go on to that. But my question is, it seems to me that we're living in a world where almost all young people are getting their information through social media, TikTok, Instagram, 120 character, messages. Will anybody pay attention to these documents in a world dominated by social media, which many people think is undermining the whole concept of the republic of letters or discourse? How do we remain optimistic in a world dominated by social media?
I'm going to say the more time you spend with young people, the more optimistic you are. I just yesterday hosted 140 students from Culbreth Middle School on UNC's campus, and there is nothing like that to make you feel a little better about the future of this country. They had so many terrific questions, then not a single one of them had a phone, which I assumed they were not allowed to do. I think that was, I could thank an adult for that. And they, I got a question, and terrific questions, and so smart. And I think just, in some ways, we just gotta trust them a little bit. We gotta educate them, gotta put, as much effort into good education as we can from K through 12 on up. But I don't know. I think there have always been technological changes, and we have a very serious one happening now. People thought people would never read again when the radio came, right? We're still reading, so I don't know.
I think at least one of the reasons I was eager to participate in this was that I was concerned that if we didn't create a book like this, whether it's in a virtual form or hard copy, that teachers, professors would rely on the internet, web sources. And once you go down that sinkhole, you never know what version of these documents they might actually be looking at. So my hope is that a curated volume like this will actually do some of the work that Kathleen's describing.
you know, when Miguel and I first started talking about it, the range of departments that were aspiring to teach a course like this was mind-boggling. Music wanted to teach a class like this. Now that, I don't know how they would do it, but it's interesting. And I'm not dismissing it out of hand, but what I wanted to do is at least make sure that students had documents and introductions that made sense, that everybody could read and would be able to utilize. And say you are in sociology and you want to approach it from that direction, fine. But at least you have the context and you have the documents and some questions so that you can make it a true learning, effective learning experience. The other thing I wanted to go back to is the students. Now, we teach college students, and we teach at a really good university, really one of the great state universities in the country. And my students were marvelous. They're just great young people who care about the right things. They try to do the right things. Once in a while, they don't. But, you know, we're talking about 18 to 22-year-olds, so you can't expect miracles. But the bottom line is they're fantastic people, and they're light years better than my generation when it comes to all sorts of issues. They don't think twice about interracial dating. They don't think twice about interracial marriage. They don't think twice about befriending people who are of a different sexual, you know, gays and lesbians. I mean, they don't think twice about that sort of thing. Why would you? They even wonder, why would you want to enslave someone because they're black? They don't get it, you know, and you have to explain it to them. That's marvelous, isn't it? Isn't that what we really wanted to teach them? That these issues were not germane, that you respect someone based on other qualities than their, you know, sexual partners or their skin color or their ethnic background or their accent or whatever. So the bottom line is, I think our students are number one.
Lloyd, if I could just circle back, I would say with my soapbox about APUSH, I think advanced placement history distilled American history down into little TikTok bite sizes. So if you are in APUSH, you can find people on TikTok who are helping you study the populist movement. That to me is that's not the way to teach history, and having students read a primary source like this. So perhaps sources like this will give students the enthusiasm to study the text as opposed to watch a TikTok video on the Populist Manifesto of 1892.
Any other questions? And I know are we at time? Are we getting to time? Okay. Yes.
There's been some research the past 8 years. It's been written about by a scholar who's looked at, on a global basis, that democracies or people in those democracies are foregoing democracy for economic prosperity, particularly in China. Do you see, and I know the United States has a short history, but would you see that as an explanation for now what appears to be occurring in this country? And based on obviously all your research, has there been periods in our past short history where that's actually occurred and we're seeing maybe a recurrence of that?
That's moving us from being historians almost to, but I think that's a question pregnant with layers. And one thing I would say is whether it is true or not that our children and our grandchildren will be less well off than we are, that's the rhetoric that we've been hearing in the United States. You could even say, in a way, it goes back to Jimmy Carter's famous or infamous speech about living in an age of limits. But in any case, I think how Americans deal with the question of no longer rising expectations of affluence, and perhaps either static or even declining levels of affluence, is arguably a question Americans have never had to deal with before. And so that's why I say, as a historian, I'm scared to offer wisdom on that, but I think the question you're asking is a crucial one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I look at my own family. My dad's father was a janitor. My mom's dad was a baker who lost his job in the Depression and sold tokens in a booth for the New York subway system. My dad was in World War II. He gets the GI Bill. It transforms the family. So I have had 4 brothers. Everyone had a college degree. 4 of the 5 of us had graduate degrees. Opportunity. My dad sees the opportunity. It transformed the family. By the way, I have a bunch of first cousins on my dad's side, and none of them got a college degree, except, you know, and he had 4 brothers and sisters. So my dad pushed the envelope, and it just transformed our little family. And I think that's the key. It takes one person pushing that, seizing that opportunity, and it makes all the difference. Now, the key is, of course, making sure that people have opportunity. That's, I think, what a government should be doing, making sure people have opportunity for success and making sure that they have their civil liberties preserved.
Well, I could sit here with you all night. I really could, and just continue to be in conversation with you. As a citizen of this state, of this country, I want to thank you for putting this book together. I really do. I can't help but invoke the name of John Hope Franklin as I sit here and I think about it. As I read this, I thought about Dr. Franklin and his autobiography, Mirror to America, where this offers a mirror for us to look at ourselves. And one of the points that I think that has stuck out to me in his book is that he said there are flaws, right? You all make the point that there are 3 major points here that people should take away. One, that first, it's imperfect. This is an imperfect union. We're working toward a more perfect union. 2, that it is a process, right? And engaging in the process. And 3, that it's negotiated. All right, I saw that one, and the current city manager in Asheville said to me one day, she said, Darin, democracy is a contact sport, right? And it really is. So suit up, get your helmets, suit up. But Dr. Franklin made the point that as we look in that mirror, yeah, we see the flaws, but you still have to be saying, well, you know, when I look in the mirror today and as I get older, I definitely see the flaws. But you have to still be willing to say that there's something good about the image that you see. And so I hope that what this book will do, and I hope that everyone will pick up a copy and not just have it, you know, your students have the advantage of it, but just engage these documents and use it as a mirror and think about what is good about what it is that we have all been involved in this country. So thank you all so much for putting.
Could I just, we have to have a shout out for Sophie. Sophie, where's Sophie?
Sophie Howell.
Come on, Sophie. Stand up, please.
Come on,
Stand
Sophie.
up. Stand up.
Sophie Howells is our co-editor, along with Miguel Lacerna.
Right, and just, Sophie did enormous amounts of, well, binding us together
Well, the professors will be here for a little while longer in a reception out in the lobby, so we hope you just stay around and engage in conversation. And thank you all for being here tonight.